Hello viewers, today I'm going to answer the question, should I service my transmission or should I leave it alone after this? Welcome back to the Moose Mobile Auto Repair channel. And so today I've been receiving a lot of comments over the past few months or so, and a lot of people have asked me that if they should service their transmission or not. And they've also told me that they just recently came back from the mechanic shop, and the mechanic stated that they should not service the transmission, but that's going to be dependent on your vehicle and the service history, and if the vehicle has had known transmission problems or not. So it's going to be dependent on a variety of factors. So whether you have an automatic or a CVT transmission, the concept is going to remain the same. And so some factors include the age of the vehicle, uh, the the model and known problems of the vehicle, and also the service history. If there has been prior transmission service in the past, that's also going to matter as well. And so you're going to have to take all of these things into consideration to make the decision if you need to service or not service the transmission. Some manufacturers will have a variety of recommended service intervals. Some manufacturers will say every 48,000 kilometers or every 96,000 kilometers, every 5 to 6 years. So I live in Canada, so we go by kilometers. Now, if you live in the USA, you are going to go by miles. So 48,000 kilometers, for instance, is about 30,000 miles. 96,000 kilometers is about 60,000 miles. Now, typically, the sooner you change the transmission fluid is the better, because the transmissions, they produce heat, and heat is what breaks down the fluid. And so the fluid is responsible for lubricating and protecting and cleaning the transmission. So over time, the additives and the lubricating properties, they wear out with time, with heat and age. And so after some amount of time and mileage accumulated, the transmission fluid will no longer be able to do its job. And so that fluid eventually will start to discolor and to get darker and darker. And then eventually, worst case scenario, it will turn black. When the fluid breaks down, it's no longer doing its job in protecting the transmission. So you have to understand that you need to change the fluid as soon as possible in order to protect the transmission. The whole purpose of having a transmission is to keep that transmission clean and to maintain it. Now, it's imperative to have good, proper, and clean fluid inside the transmission, because it's hydraulically and electronically operated. And so the transmission relies on clean fluid in order to work properly. So if the fluid is very dirty and old, it's not going to work properly, and is going to start causing problems In some cases, you'll start getting rough shifts and shuddering as you are going through the gears. And so the problem is that you want to make sure that the transmission is maintained properly. So I'll give you an example. Uh, let's say that there's a vehicle that has 300,000 kilometers or more. So let's say that's about 187 500 miles, about 300,000 kilometers. And so let's say that this vehicle has never ever had a transmission service, and let's say it's the original transmission, and the fluid is dark. Let's say the vehicle drives relatively okay, but the transmission, it has a little bit, it jerks a bit in between the gears. And so in this case, you probably don't want to change the transmission fluid, because if you do change the transmission fluid, uh, the transmission could fail in just a few thousand kilometers or miles after the service. Now, the issue with a transmission that has never had a service is that when you do a drain and fill, that new fluid will mix with the old fluid, and any contaminants, dirt, or debris that may have built up inside the transmission may allow the new fluid to dislodge those contaminants and circulate in the transmission. And so those contaminants could get into and clog up critical components, such as the valve body and other components inside the transmission. So this all could happen in just a few thousand miles or kilometers of driving after the service. And so the old fluid may still contain clutch material or the friction material, which is pretty much the clutch packs inside the automatic transmissions. And so when you drain that old fluid and introduce new fluid uh, into the transmission, the transmission could stop shifting properly, and so that will cause a failure after a few thousand kilometers or miles after the service. So you have to take into consideration on how is the transmission behaving now, right? So is it shifting properly, or it's not shifting properly? So you need to take that into consideration, and you might need to do some analysis and research, and possibly take the vehicle to a mechanic shop to have them analyze the transmission before any services are done. So you can take the vehicle on a road test. You have to see on how does it drive. Does it jerk between gears, or does it drive and shift normally? If it already jerks between shifts, and the vehicle has high mileage, and and you don't plan to spend any more money on that vehicle, then it's best to leave the transmission alone. But the problem is that when you start uh, performing a service on these transmissions that have never had a service, that's when it's possible that the transmission could fail after that. Now, say the transmission drives fine, the vehicle drives fine, it shifts okay, and there's no issues, and you have 160,000 kilometers or 200,000 kilometers or whatever, or over 100,000 miles, let's say, and it has never had a service, then most likely you will be okay if there's no problems. But if there's already issues, and you're feeling that there's like extremely abrupt or rough shifts, then it's possible that if you service the transmission, it could fail. Otherwise, if you service it, there shouldn't be any problems in a majority of cases. Now I'm going to be discussing about some vehicles, such as the domestic or American cars, such as Ford and GM, because these vehicles, a majority of them, they have a removable and serviceable transmission pan and filter. So on these transmissions, you may be able to see on how much longer it can go for. Now you won't know in terms of exactly on the mileage on how much longer it will go for, but you may be able to make a good judgment call and say how many years is left on the transmission until it's going to fail. So you'll be able to get like a ballpark clue uh, by having a look inside the transmission pan. Now, if you have a vehicle and it's never been serviced and you're already having problems driving it and it won't shift properly, and say it doesn't have a serviceable transmission pan, and you drain the fluid, and when you drain the fluid, if you see a bunch of like metallic particles and debris as you are draining it, and you take a sample, like you put it inside a cup and you have a look at it. If you see anything that's that has like a glittery debris or something, then more likely than not that transmission has already been damaged, and you should be looking for a rebuild, or most likely a replacement. I don't think a rebuild is going to be possible if it's completely damaged to that point. So in the next few minutes or so, I'm just going to be putting a few pictures on the screen, just analyzing the fluid and the transmission pan, and just go from there. Now there is this one I'm going to put up on the screen somewhere. There's this particular vehicle I worked on personally. It hasn't had any transmission problems, but this vehicle has not had transmission service in a very, very long time. Uh, I'm not sure on how long, but I don't even know if it has had a transmission service in the past or not. But it went for well over 100,000, 200,000 or so without a service. It still shifts and runs okay. There's no problems. So this particular one, I pulled the pan off, and you can see that the fluid is really dark. It's not black, but it's like a really, really dark brown color. And if you look closely, there is not much metallic debris on the two of the circular magnets here. So there's not much debris at all. And so this transmission still seems to be okay. Hasn't been maintained all that well, but I can safely say that this transmission, it will go for a very long time. I don't see any signs that it's going to fail soon. This transmission is going to continue most likely for a very long time. Now, on this particular one, you don't see too much of the metallic debris on the magnets or in the fluid. So in most cases, there's not that much of the wear and tear inside the transmission. So this customer, they got extremely lucky, and yeah, so uh, that's the first one. And then we are going to continue on the other ones. The other ones are just going to be pictures off of the internet. It's not me that has serviced these transmissions, but these are good examples. So again, this is from a Ford vehicle. I'm not sure which vehicle it's from. It could be from like a most likely like a Crown Victoria, possibly. It's from an older vehicle. So I'm just using these as examples. So just to show you guys. So on this first picture here, uh, this looks relatively okay. There's not that much metallic debris uh, on the magnets. There's only a small amount, and that's just like normal wear and tear. And in the fluid still looks relatively okay. It's like a orangey, reddish orangey a color, a slight brownish color, but that's okay. This transmission still looks fine. It doesn't show any signs that the transmission is failing, and so this transmission will continue for quite some time. Now, if you pay attention to the yellow plug here, they call it the stopper. This is just a plug that they put inside when the vehicle is on the assembly line. When they assemble the transmissions, they plugged up the transmission to prevent any dirt or debris. So when they insert the dipstick inside the transmission, this yellow stopper falls inside the transmission pan, and it's harmless. It won't do any damage. It'll just be laying inside the transmission pan. So when you service these Ford vehicles, when you remove the pan, if you see these yellow stoppers, this indicates that the vehicle has not had a transmission service. This is the first transmission service. So that yellow stopper, you just take them out and discard them. So now on the second type of picture, the same transmission, you can see there's a lot of metallic debris on the magnets, and you can see the flaky and glittery and grayish uh, particles suspended in the fluid on the pan. You can see the fluid is like a very dark grayish, almost black, really dark brown color. And so this is indicative that this transmission has problems. It's probably still working, but not shifting smoothly. Most likely that this transmission is jerking and shuddering, but still drivable. And I was gonna say that that failure is very likely very soon. It's really hard to say in kilometers or miles or years, but this transmission is not going to last that much longer. So it could be a year, it could be 5, 10, 15,000 kilometers. You can't say really exactly, but on what you can say is that this transmission already has problems and it's going to fail very soon because of all of these particles inside the transmission pan. Now, the last one here uh, has a bunch of metal and flakes inside the transmission pan. The fluid is pretty dark, uh, almost black, very dark brown, grayish black color. You can see the flaky and glittery debris in the pan, and the magnet is completely covered in flakes of metal on the magnet. and you can see flakes of metal all over inside the pan, and this transmission has problems, and most likely is barely drivable. So uh, servicing this transmission is not going to save it because the damage has already been done. So there's no saving this one. Most likely, this needs a rebuild or a complete replacement because it's completely damaged. So you can tell the condition of transmissions just by inspecting the transmission pan uh, in a majority of cases. So say that the vehicle that you have is driving fine, has very high mileage, hasn't had a service. I think it might be fine to do a service. It shouldn't do any harm. And the issue is that if you don't service the transmission, then sooner or later you are going to be having to replace that transmission or getting a new vehicle, because if you don't service your transmission at all, then more likely than not, the transmission is going to fail. And once it fails, you will have to take the expense in replacing it, or replacing the entire vehicle. So unless you have a very old vehicle that you don't want to spend too much money on, and is still driving relatively okay, and then that's probably the situation in which you do not want to service the transmission. But if you have like a really nice vehicle, and the resale value is relatively high, then you probably want to service those transmissions on those vehicles, especially that it's still driving relatively okay. One other thing I forgot to mention is that on those kind of vehicles, you probably want to do a couple drain and fills or so, and in some cases, on some uh, equipment, it's safe to do a flush. Some manufacturers don't recommend flushing their transmissions because it could damage it. Now, back in the day when I used to work at several shops, there was one particular shop that I worked at, and this shop they use BG machines, and so one particular machine that we had, it was a BG transmission flush machine, and so we used to do transmission flushes all the time, and we have never had a single problem of flushing the transmissions. Now, when you flush the transmission, you basically you get all of the fluid out, and you replace it with new fluid, because when you do a drain and fill, you're only draining on whatever is in the transmission pan, and so you probably like draining a third or so of the transmission. The other 2/3 would be inside the torque converter, and in the transmission hoses, and the radiator, and where the transmission cooler is, and also there would be still leftover fluid in the transmission itself. So when you're doing a drain and fill, you're only changing out like a third of the fluid, and so the issue with that is that you're having new fluid and old fluid, and then when you start the vehicle up, the old and the new fluid is going to mix it all up, and so when that happens, the fluid is just going to be dirty again if the transmission is not clean. But if it's clean, you might not see the difference. But typically, when you do a drain and fill, it's not going to be enough just to do one drain and fill service. You may have to do several drain and fills in order to get the fluid to be completely clean. In some other cases, you can disconnect one of the hoses for the transmission cooler lines and flush it out that way, as long as you are adding fluid in the transmission as you are flushing out the cooler lines, and that will clean out the transmission then. Now, on some vehicles that do have a replaceable transmission filter and pan and everything, you can do a drain and fill, and you can also remove the pan, change the filter, and that's going to help to get the fluid out and to clean the transmission. So if you want, it's probably best to remove the pan and change the filter on some cars that have the a removable pan. It's not only the American cars, but also some of the Japanese cars, like on some Toyotas and Nissans and so on. You can still drop the pan and change the filter on those ones, and that's going to be a little bit beneficial for the Japanese vehicles like Toyotas and Nissans and so on. So you can still change the filters on those ones. It's not only the domestic or the American cars. On the American cars, you have no choice. You have to drop the pan and change the filter, because they usually don't have a separate drain plug, so they force you to drop the pan on those vehicles. So overall, if your vehicle is not having shifting problems and it has accumulated mileage and it hasn't had any service done, it's probably safe to proceed and perform with the transmission service. Now, if you have a vehicle that has very high mileage and it's not shifting all that well, but still drives relatively okay, those are the vehicles you don't want to do a transmission service on, because performing a service on those ones could cause the transmission to fail within a few thousand kilometers or miles. Now, the last thing I wanted to mention is that you don't want to service the transmission too often, because that's not good, because because over time the clutch packs, they wear down, and so the friction material uh, sometimes the will be suspended in the fluid. So every time you change the fluid, you are losing a little bit of that friction material, and so you don't want to do the service too often, but you want to do it a little bit before on what the manufacturer states, and then you should be okay. Because the automatic transmissions, they contain wet clutch packs, so these clutch packs uh, rely on clean fluid, but it's not good to change the fluid uh, too often. You don't want to go too overboard on the servicing, so just as needed. And if you do a lot of high RPM driving, or if you're racing, if you drive aggressively all the time, then you will probably need to change the fluid a bit more often, because every rise in temperature of the transmission fluid is going to cut the life of the fluid in half, and so you want to service your transmission more often than and what the normal or the severe service interval recommends. There is a rule of thumb with the transmission fluid temperature, so you won't know unless you use a scan tool to check the transmission temperature. And so the rule of thumb is that for every increase of 20 degrees Fahrenheit above the standard 175 degrees Fahrenheit is going to cut the life of the fluid in half. So the uh, the service interval is going to be cut in half each time. So let's say example 50,000 miles, 80,000 kilometers. So for every 20 degrees Fahrenheit uh, increase, that's going to reduce the service interval. So 50,000 miles will go to 25,000 miles, which is roughly how many kilometers is that? 25,000 miles is 40,000 kilometers. And so it keeps going. The standard is 175 Fahrenheit. So if it goes to 195 Fahrenheit, the fluid life is reduced in half. So from 195 to 215 to 235. So each time it goes up above the 175 mark by 20 degrees increase is going to cut the life of the fluid in half. And so therefore you will need to change the fluid sooner. So I'm going to conclude this video for today. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. That's it for today. If you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, please don't forget to give it a like, and please consider subscribing to my channel if you're not already a subscriber, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Have a good night and take care.